Chapter 1. Flames Beyond the Walls. Phoenix, Arizona, 2012. Laura Sanders had lived in her modest one-story house for only 2 years, yet it already felt like her sanctuary from a world that had given her little rest. At 34, working nights as a nurse in a trauma ward, she treasured silence and ordinary comforts. The hum of her old refrigerator, the thin curtains that kept the desert sun at bay, the small rose bushes she had planted in the backyard. Her life had narrowed to simple rituals of survival. Sleep, work, repeat. But in that narrowing, she had found something resembling peace. On this particular day, she allowed herself the luxury of staying home rather than rushing through errands. A week of consecutive overnight shifts had drained her body to the point where every muscle ached. She brewed tea, drew the blinds, and let herself collapse into bed, just as the neighborhood was stirring awake. When she rose again in the evening, the house felt unusually quiet, as though the walls were holding their breath. Outside, the desert sky faded into deep orange, but inside, a different, more sinister glow was preparing to emerge. It began subtly, a faint odor that drifted through the air like a memory she could not quite place. At first she thought it was a neighbor's lawn equipment, maybe spilled fuel from a mower or a generator running too long. Yet the smell did not fade. It grew sharper, heavier, invasive. Laura stood still in her kitchen, the floor cool beneath her bare feet, and realized the odor was not coming from outside. It was rising, creeping upward from beneath the floorboards, saturating the air in a way that set every nerve on edge. Her instincts, sharpened by years in emergency medicine, kicked in with startling force. This was not normal. The scent was unmistakable now. Gasoline, thick and acrid, impossible to confuse with anything else. She moved quickly toward the front door, expecting to throw it open and escape into the fresh desert night. But when her hand closed around the knob, resistance met her. The lock did not turn. She frowned, twisted harder, then rattled the door in frustration. The bolt was not just locked, it was wedged, secured in a way she had never done herself. Panic surged, hot and immediate, as she realized she was not locked in by accident. Someone had made sure the exit was sealed. She darted toward the back door, heart hammering against her ribs. The same resistance met her there. Every window she tried yielded nothing but stubborn frames nailed shut or warped by some unseen hand. Her breaths came faster, and with each one, the stench of fuel thickened, clawing down her throat and burning her lungs. She felt trapped inside a box carefully prepared for destruction. Then, outside the glass of her living room window, a sudden flash bloomed. A streak of orange burst upward, licking at the night air with greedy fingers. In seconds, the faint glow became a furious blaze, reflecting in the panes and throwing her shadow across the walls. The fire was not starting naturally. It leapt in multiple places at once, as if the ground itself had been soaked and ignited deliberately. Laura pressed her palms to the cold glass, her eyes wide, and comprehension struck like a physical blow. This was no accident. The timing, the smell, the locked doors, it was all part of a plan. Someone had wanted this house reduced to ashes, and someone had counted on her not being there. But she was there, alive, awake, and staring into the jaws of the inferno that had been set for her. The heat intensified almost immediately, seeping through walls, warping the edges of photographs, curling papers into brittle spirals of ash. The air grew thicker with smoke that forced her into violent coughing fits, each one scraping her lungs raw. The ceiling groaned under the strain of growing flames, a low, dreadful sound like the earth itself was cracking open above her. She staggered backward, covering her mouth with her sleeve, but the thin fabric offered little protection. For a moment she froze, paralyzed not just by fear but by betrayal. Her thoughts sharpened to the people who had keys, those who had reason and access. Her family, the ones who claimed blood bound them together, had been speaking in hushed tones about money, about insurance, She had dismissed it as idle talk, the way people complained when bills piled too high. Now, standing in her burning home, she realized it had not been idle at all. They had wagered her life against a payout, assuming she would not be inside when the fire consumed everything. The realization ignited something colder and stronger than the flames devouring her home. It was not only terror that filled her, it was fury. She was not meant to survive, yet survival was the only thing she intended to do. Each inhale of smoke felt like poison, but each exhale carried a vow. She would not let them erase her, not here, not tonight. The fire roared louder, pressing against the windows until glass cracked with sharp reports. Embers drifted inside, glowing fragments of destruction landing on the wooden floorboards. Laura backed away, her mind racing through options, her body trembling with adrenaline. Somewhere in the chaos, a fragile clarity formed. Escape was still possible if she acted, if she refused to collapse beneath the weight of heat and betrayal. The flames had been meant to erase her presence from this world quietly. Another accident in a desert city where fires were common. But they had underestimated her will. The house might burn, the possessions might vanish, but Laura Sanders would not be swallowed so easily. Chapter 2. Struggle against the fire. The fire advanced with terrifying speed, as if the house itself had been waiting for the spark to consume it. The air thickened to the density of tar, each breath scraping Laura's throat raw. Heat pressed against her skin in relentless waves, blistering, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. She stumbled toward the sink in the small laundry room, turned on the faucet, and soaked a dish towel until it dripped. With shaking hands, she pressed the wet fabric over her mouth and nose, remembering fragments of hospital training about smoke inhalation. The cool dampness gave her a fleeting sense of control, but it was fragile, slipping away with every rising degree of heat. In the kitchen, curtains burst into flames with a sound like paper tearing, and fire raced up the walls with greedy speed. The cabinets above the stove crackled, their glossy finish bubbling into warped shapes. Pots and pans clattered to the floor as the shelves surrendered to the heat, ringing against the tiles like desperate alarms. Above her head, the ceiling groaned and snapped, each sound a reminder that the roof could collapse at any moment. The house no longer felt like shelter. It had become a cage designed to end her. Laura's eyes watered violently, her vision narrowing to a tunnel of smoke and flame. She staggered through the hallway, disoriented, her shoulder brushing against walls that burned hot to the touch. With every step, the fire seemed to pursue her, a predator closing in. Her thoughts darted wildly, searching for an escape. The front and back doors had been useless, their locks jammed against her frantic attempts. The living room windows had already been claimed by the flames. That left only one possibility. The small bathroom window she had always considered too narrow to be practical. The bathroom door stuck against the swollen frame, but she slammed her body into it with all the strength she had left. It gave way with a jolt, and she stumbled inside, coughing violently as smoke curled around her. The tiny room already carried the suffocating stench of burning wood, but the window offered a sliver of hope. It was small, almost square, set high on the wall above the bathtub. A faint shimmer of night air pressed against the glass from outside, a reminder that freedom was only inches away, yet impossibly far. Laura scanned the cramped room for something heavy. Her eyes landed on a wooden stool she used to reach the upper shelves. She dragged it to the tub, her hands trembling as she climbed up, the stool wobbling beneath her. With all the force she could summon, she swung it into the glass. The first blow cracked the pane into a spiderweb of fractures. The second sent shards raining down, scattering into the porcelain tub and onto the tiled floor. She pulled at the jagged edges, not caring when they sliced her palms and forearms. Blood mixed with soot, painting her skin in streaks of red and black. The opening was barely wide enough, but there was no other option. She shoved one arm through, then a shoulder, scraping herself raw against the jagged frame. Her breath came in frantic gasps, each inhale dragging more smoke into her lungs. Pain flared as glass tore into her side, but she forced herself forward, wriggling until her body collapsed halfway through. The final push scraped her legs against the frame until fabric and skin gave way, and then suddenly she was outside, falling hard onto the gravel below. The ground was cold compared to the inferno behind her. The shock of it sent a jolt through her entire body, her bare feet digging into the earth as she tried to scramble upright. She coughed violently, each heave racking her ribs, black smoke pouring out of her lungs. Above her, the roofline of the house glowed bright orange, flames roaring like a living creature finally unchained. Sparks flew upward, carried into the night sky on violent gusts of heat. Her body refused to stand fully, so she crawled, scraping her knees and hands on the dirt, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and the collapsing structure. Behind her came the unmistakable crash of timber breaking apart, a roar that reverberated in her chest like thunder. She kept moving until the cool night air began to cut through the haze of smoke that clung to her, until her lungs could draw in something that resembled breath. When she finally turned, her eyes stung with tears, and through the blur she saw them. Dark silhouettes against the glow of destruction. Figures moving quickly, striding away from the blaze with steady, unhurried steps. They did not look back. Their bodies carried no trace of panic, no sign of horror at the inferno that devoured the house. It was as though they had rehearsed this moment, choreographed every detail until it unfolded exactly as they had planned. Laura's vision swam, but her mind registered the cold truth. The fire had not been an accident of faulty wiring or forgotten candles. It was a deliberate act, carried out by hands she knew. Those shadows belonged to people she had trusted with her name, her life, her family bond. They had counted on her absence, perhaps even prayed for her presence, so long as the flames left nothing behind. Her chest heaved with a mixture of rage and disbelief as the silhouettes disappeared into the night. Around her, the world seemed to narrow into two opposing realities: the ruins of a life she had built, and the unbearable knowledge that betrayal had lit the match. The ground shook again with another collapse, sending sparks scattering into the desert air. Her heart pounded to its rhythm, a relentless reminder that she had lived through the fire, meant to end her. Chapter 3. Ashes and Betrayal. By the time the last flames died, dawn had already begun to bleed across the Arizona desert. The fire crews had worked for hours, their silhouettes blurred by smoke and sparks as they fought a blaze that refused to surrender easily. When the final jets of water hissed against the smoldering remains, silence followed, broken only by the occasional groan of collapsing beams. The house that once stood as Laura's sanctuary had been reduced to a skeleton of blackened wood and twisted metal. What had been her living room was now an open cavity of ash, and her bedroom, where she had dreamed of safety after long hospital shifts, was nothing more than a heap of charred debris. She stood at the perimeter, wrapped in a blanket the firefighters had given her, though no amount of fabric could warm the cold hollow forming in her chest. The smoke clung to her hair, her skin, her lungs. Every breath carried with it the taste of ruin. Neighbors had gathered quietly across the street, their faces etched with shock and curiosity, whispering in tones too low for her to hear clearly, but loud enough for her to feel their eyes on her. The house had been her pride, modest but entirely her own, a symbol of independence earned through years of relentless work. Now it was gone, swallowed whole in one night. When daylight spread fully, investigators stepped carefully across the remains. Laura's gaze followed them, her stomach tightening as they pulled a metal canister from the wreckage. It was scorched and dented, but recognizable. Gasoline. Its presence left little doubt. She did not need an official report to understand that the fire had been no accident. It had been planted, prepared, executed with precision. Her pulse pounded with the confirmation of what her body already knew from the first breath of fumes the night before. Someone had intended for her home to vanish in flames. The weight of betrayal pressed heavier than the smoke. Family had always been complicated for Laura, but she had never let herself believe they would go this far. As whispers traveled through the neighborhood in the following days, fragments of truth surfaced. People mentioned paperwork, overheard conversations, unusual activity in the weeks before the blaze. It did not take long for the pieces to form a picture too sharp to ignore. Her half-brother David and her stepmother Caroline had recently arranged a large insurance policy on the house. They had framed it as a practical step, a way to secure the family's assets. She had been naive enough not to question their motives. Now, with her home reduced to cinders, the timing of their decision spoke louder than words. Each rumor cut deeper. Some neighbors recalled seeing David's truck near the property days earlier, parked longer than seemed necessary. Others remembered Caroline's casual remarks about how much value the land beneath the house might hold. Every recollection layered itself over Laura's grief, transforming sorrow into a slow, simmering anger. It was not just her home that had been destroyed. It was trust, already fragile, now obliterated. The very people who should have guarded her had instead orchestrated her ruin, gambling her existence for a payout. As she walked among the ruins in the following mornings, her shoes sinking into ash that puffed like smoke at each step, she tried to recognize familiar outlines. A warped iron frame was all that remained of her bed. Her bookshelf had collapsed into a mound of blackened lumps, once novels and nursing texts. The rose bushes she had planted were nothing but stubs of brittle stems. She crouched to sift through the debris, but even objects made of metal had melted into unrecognizable forms. It was as though the fire had conspired to erase her history as completely as possible. Yet in that emptiness, a different kind of clarity emerged. Standing on the very ground where she had once felt most secure, Laura understood that her family's betrayal went beyond greed. They had not cared whether she was inside. Perhaps they had hoped she was not, but they had not checked, had not warned, had not thought her life worthy of protection. To them, she was collateral, a detail overshadowed by the lure of money. That realization burned hotter than the flames had, but instead of consuming her, it hardened something inside her. The investigators continued their work, photographing every angle, marking evidence with small flags that fluttered in the desert wind. Laura remained nearby, watching with quiet intensity. To outsiders, she might have looked defeated, wrapped still in a borrowed coat, her eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. But beneath the surface, something else was taking shape. She was beginning to see her path not as one of retreat, but of pursuit. The truth had to be uncovered, not just for herself, but to strip away the mask of those who had tried to bury her under ash. As the sun climbed higher, the ruins shimmered with heat, releasing one last veil of smoke into the sky. Laura took a step back, breathing in the acrid scent one final time. The house was gone, but she remained, and with her remained a cold determination. The fire had destroyed her possessions, but it had not destroyed her will. If anything, it had given her a clarity she had never possessed before. The people who had plotted her downfall would not be allowed to walk away unchallenged. From that morning onward, Laura's grief became fused with purpose, and beneath the ashes of betrayal, a quiet vow took root. Chapter 4. Traces in the Fire. The official investigation began as soon as the last embers cooled. Fire marshals arrived with heavy boots and clipboards, moving methodically through the blackened ruins. Laura watched them from a distance, her arms crossed tightly, her body shivering not from the desert morning chill, but from the memory of heat still lodged in her skin. They crouched low, brushed soot aside, photographed fragments of collapsed beams, and sniffed the air, like hunters tracing a predator. Their tools detected patterns invisible to the naked eye, and soon those patterns began to tell a story. Within days, the preliminary report confirmed what Laura had already known in her bones. The fire had not been born in one place. Multiple points of origin had been identified, each one marked by deep charring and unusual residue. In the remains of the kitchen, A clear line traced across the floor like a scar, an unnatural trail of accelerant that had carried flames with surgical precision. Another cluster of burns near the hallway suggested the same. It was as if someone had painted pathways of fire deliberately, ensuring that the house would ignite too quickly to save. The report used calm technical language, but the conclusion was stark. Arson. Laura felt both vindicated and hollow when she read the findings. Truth was there in writing, yet truth alone could not restore what she had lost. The officials passed their files to the insurance company, and that was where the second revelation struck like a hammer. A claim had already been submitted less than 24 hours after the blaze. Someone had not even waited for the ashes to cool before attempting to profit. The paperwork listed David and Caroline as the interested parties, citing the new policy they had taken out on the property under the guise of family protection. To outsiders, it looked like a tragic coincidence. To Laura, it was evidence of planning so callous it made her skin crawl. She refused to remain a passive witness. If those who betrayed her thought the fire would erase her voice, they had underestimated her resilience. Laura began to construct her own case, gathering fragments of proof like shards of glass from the ruins. Her first discovery came in David's garage. Under a pile of tools and rags, she found receipts crumpled but intact, showing recent bulk purchases of gasoline. The dates matched the week before the fire. To anyone else, they might appear ordinary, the kind of routine errand any man might run. To her, they glowed like smoking guns. Caroline's carelessness yielded more. While combing through her stepmother's discarded papers and records, Laura uncovered notes scribbled in the margins of an insurance pamphlet, questions about payout timeframes, coverage for total loss, and legal beneficiaries. Even more damning were the phone records she managed to obtain. The logs revealed lengthy conversations between Caroline and an agent in the days leading up to the blaze, her voice captured in recordings discussing specific terms of the policy with a precision that betrayed urgency. Listening to them late at night, Laura felt the cold weight of betrayal pressing deeper. These were not the words of someone preparing for the future in good faith. They were the calculations of someone preparing for destruction. Piece by piece, the file she built grew thicker. She organized photographs of the burn trails left on her floors, copies of receipts showing suspicious purchases, transcripts of Caroline's insurance calls, and the official fire marshal's report. Each document was like a spoke in a wheel, and together they formed a machine of undeniable evidence. Every item tightened the circle, pushing her closer to exposing the truth. Walking through the charred remains of her home became less about mourning and more about focus. She traced the lines of destruction the way investigators had, her eyes following the unnatural symmetry of flames. She crouched to run her fingers over blackened tiles, imagining the deliberate hands that had poured accelerant there. In the silence of the ruins, she promised herself that their attempt to reduce her to nothing would not succeed. They had tried to turn her house into currency, her existence into collateral damage. They had gambled that no one would question the story. But Laura's survival had altered the narrative. She was the witness they had not accounted for, the inconvenient fact they could not erase. Her grief had already hardened into resolve, and now she carried within her not only anger, but also proof. The evidence she collected was not just paper and ash. It was her shield and her weapon, the tools with which she would carve open the facade of lies her family had constructed. At night, as she sorted through the growing pile of documents on the small table of the temporary apartment she rented, she no longer felt powerless. She imagined the wheel turning. Each spoke a step closer to justice, each rotation pulling her betrayers into the light. The fire had tried to consume her, but in its aftermath she had become something stronger. In the ashes lay not only ruins, but also the traces of truth, and Laura was determined to follow every one of them to the end. Chapter 5. Fracture within the family. When the case files were handed to the investigators, the reaction from the family unfolded exactly as Laura had anticipated. Denial came first, swift and rehearsed, as though the words had been waiting on their tongues long before any questions were asked. David insisted that he had spent the entire night at a bar on the other side of town, claiming witnesses would vouch for him. Caroline swore she had been at home asleep, maintaining that nothing had pulled her from her bed that evening. Yet the surveillance footage told a different story. The grainy images captured their car near Laura's street in the hours before the blaze. No amount of deflection could erase the fact that the shadows of betrayal were recorded for all to see. When investigators pressed them, the cracks widened. David's timeline did not align with credit card transactions. Caroline's story shifted with every retelling, her words growing brittle under the weight of contradiction. Each attempt to cover their steps created only deeper holes, exposing fractures not just in their alibis, but in the very fabric of their alliance. The facade of unity that once held them together began to crumble, revealing a rot long hidden beneath a surface of civility. Laura watched all of this from her quiet seat in the corner of the interrogation rooms. She was not required to speak. Her presence alone carried weight sharper than any question. The silence she maintained became unbearable for those under scrutiny. Her eyes, steady and cold, forced them to confront what they had done without the buffer of excuses. No plea for sympathy remained in her. No trace of the woman who once sought scraps of approval from her family. She had transformed into something unyielding, a witness who carried the burn of fire in her gaze. The investigators noted the shift as well. Questions once directed toward her relatives began to reveal how unsteady their alliance had always been. Small disagreements about details turned into open contradictions. David, once arrogant and dismissive, started to hint that Caroline might have handled the insurance arrangements without his full knowledge. Caroline, pale and rigid, countered by suggesting David had been the one purchasing unusual amounts of gasoline. Each word they spoke pushed them further apart, eroding the illusion that they stood on the same side. Family gatherings that had once echoed with artificial warmth were now reimagined by Laura as staging grounds for betrayal. The people who had once whispered about her weakness, dismissing her independence as recklessness, now found themselves trembling under the weight of exposure. The same voices that had judged her unworthy were forced to stumble through explanations for their own actions, explanations that grew weaker each time. The reversal of power was undeniable. They feared her silence more than they had ever feared her words. Outside the walls of the station, whispers began circulating among extended relatives and acquaintances. Rumors of evidence and testimony spread quickly, and with them, reputations started to decay. Those who had proudly worn the mask of respectability now found it slipping beyond repair. Friends distanced themselves. Colleagues grew cautious. Every circle they belonged to began to shrink as the truth seeped through. The perfect image of a united family shattered into fragments too sharp to piece back together. Laura did not rejoice, but neither did she grieve for what collapsed. She recognized the inevitable unraveling of something that had been brittle all along. Their strength had been built on appearances and intimidation, never on trust or loyalty. The fire had not only exposed their intentions, but had forced them to turn against one another, clawing for survival at the expense of the other. The bond they once claimed was unbreakable now dissolved under the scrutiny of facts too solid to ignore. What had once been a family portrait now resembled a battlefield. David and Caroline faced investigators separately, each session pulling them further into opposition. Their stories diverged until the contradictions became impossible to smooth over. Every new piece of evidence drove the wedge deeper. Every uncovered lie pushed them further apart. The unity they had flaunted fractured completely, leaving nothing but bitterness, suspicion, and fear. For Laura, watching them unravel carried a sense of grim clarity. The fire had consumed her house, but the aftermath consumed them. Their lies collapsed under the same weight as the charred beams of her roof, brittle and unsustainable. They had believed she was fragile, easy to dismiss, incapable of standing against them. Yet in silence, with the strength of survival etched into her eyes, she became the mirror in which they saw their own destruction. Chapter 6. Trial and Retribution. The courthouse in downtown Phoenix was suffocatingly full the morning the trial began. Rows of benches creaked under the weight of onlookers, reporters, and neighbors who had followed the story from the moment smoke rose above Laura's home. The air buzzed with whispers that died down only when the judge entered, bringing with him an atmosphere of solemn gravity. Laura sat silently in the front row, her posture upright, her face still. She carried no sign of triumph, only the heavy calm of someone who had already walked through fire and now waited for justice to confirm what survival had already proven. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the charges. The words cut through the silence like a scalpel. Arson, attempted murder, insurance fraud. Each phrase reverberated across the room, and the weight of them seemed to settle directly onto David and Caroline, seated stiffly beside their defense attorneys. For a moment they appeared united, their faces locked into practiced masks of disbelief. But as the evidence began to unfurl, their unity unraveled quickly. The fire marshal's report was presented first. Large photographs were displayed for the jury, showing the multiple points of origin, the unnatural trails of accelerant across the floors, and the canister recovered from the wreckage. The scientific explanation was measured and professional, but the conclusion was devastating. Fires of such nature did not start themselves. The cause had been deliberate, intentional, and human. Next came the insurance documentation. An agent testified that the policy had been adjusted and expanded just days before the blaze. Signatures were displayed, timestamps noted, and the suspicious timing emphasized. The paper trail told a story clearer than any verbal testimony could. This had been premeditated. The ink on the policy was barely dry before the house was consumed by flames. Then came the surveillance footage. Though grainy, the video unmistakably captured the vehicle belonging to David and Caroline, driving near Laura's property on the night of the fire. The timestamp coincided with the estimated window of ignition. As the images flickered across the screen, the last vestiges of their alibis collapsed. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads, while Laura's eyes remained fixed on the screen, her expression unchanging. She had seen the footage before, but each time it reminded her of the coldness with which they had orchestrated her destruction. When the time arrived for their defense, David and Caroline fractured completely. David's attorney painted him as an uninvolved relative, suggesting Caroline had taken the lead in financial matters. Caroline's defense countered with the claim that David had acted alone, motivated by desperation. What was intended as protection turned into mutual destruction. In front of the jury, they became each other's accusers, tearing apart the illusion of family loyalty. Their words, meant to absolve, only confirmed the rot that had driven them. Laura did not flinch. She watched without satisfaction, without anger, her silence speaking louder than any testimony. For years they had dismissed her as fragile, incapable of strength. Now, every time they looked her way, they saw not weakness, but the living embodiment of the truth they had tried to erase. Her gaze was steady, and in it was the quiet certainty that the fire had failed to break her. The deliberation of the jury did not take long. Hours, not days. When they returned, the verdict rang out with clarity. Guilty on all counts. Arson, attempted murder, insurance fraud. Each word landed like the crack of a gavel, sealing the fate of those who had once believed they could turn her life into ash without consequence. The sentencing followed swiftly. Years of imprisonment were handed down, along with restitution and the permanent denial of any insurance payout. They would leave the courtroom not as orchestrators of an easy profit, but as convicts stripped of freedom and reputation. The collapse of their carefully maintained facade was complete. For Laura, the moment did not bring triumph, but release. She had not sought vengeance in fire or rage. She had sought truth, and truth had been delivered. Her home was gone, reduced to rubble and memory, but in its place stood something she had never possessed before: unshakable strength. She had lost walls and possessions, but she had gained clarity, and clarity could not be burned. As the courtroom emptied and the sound of footsteps echoed down the marble halls, Laura remained seated for a moment longer. She inhaled deeply, the air here free of smoke yet heavy with the weight of justice. When she finally rose, it was with the knowledge that the fire meant to end her life had, instead, ignited a different beginning. She walked out into the phoenix sun with her shoulders straight and her gaze forward, carrying nothing but herself. And for the first time, that was enough.